Hello friends, this is a very important topic for the exams purposes, especially for the anatomy and the um, surgical exams. And a couple of questions are frequently asked on this topic. So let's talk about subclavian artery and its branches. So before starting, one must know subclavian artery is divided into three parts, and the three parts are part 1, part 2, part 3, and those three parts are due to muscles scaleneus anterior or scalene anterior muscles. As we know, scalene muscles have three parts: scalene anterior, medial, middle, and posterior. So right now, for the purpose of the subclavian artery, we'll talk about scalene anterior muscle. And relation of subclavian vein and subclavian artery, one must be uh, familiar with, because subclavian vein is the one which passes anterior or in front of the scalene anterior muscle. Scaleneus or scalene, they are synonyms to each other. So subclavian vein is the one which passes in front of the scalene anterior, whereas subclavian artery is the one which passes posterior behind scalene anterior muscle. So um, as you can see in this diagram, here's the subclavian artery which is passing behind your scalene anterior, this one, scalene anterior muscle. So subclavian artery is the one which is passing behind, posterior to your scalene anterior muscle. I haven't drawn subclavian vein because it would have been in front of the scalene anterior. So leaving subclavian vein aside, let's talk about the subclavian artery. So here again, subclavian artery, since I've drawn this on the right side, subclavian artery is on the right side, this one. It arises from your brachiocephalic trunk, yeah, and your vertebral artery, of course, is a part of your subclavian artery, but your carotid also arises from your brachiocephalic trunk, which is not the case on the left side of your body. So here I haven't drawn the brachiocephalic trunk or carotid arteries, so just strictly talking about subclavian artery arising from your brachiocephalic trunk. So here you can see I have drawn three parts, and this is the first part. First part, why is it called the first part? Because it is medial to your scalene anterior muscle. It is medial. The middle part, the second part of the subclavian artery, here somewhere, this portion, only the very little portion, it is behind, posterior to your subclavian artery. And your part 3 of the subclavian artery is lateral to your scalene anterior muscle. So this is how we name part 1, part 2, part 3, three parts of your subclavian artery based on its location in relation to your scalene anterior. If it's medial, it's part 1. If it's behind, it's part 2. And if it's lateral to scalene anterior, it's part 3. So let's talk about the branches of this arising from each part of this subclavian artery. Subclavian artery, you can see, it is from here just till here, till your first rib, yeah, till your superior surface of your first rib is your subclavian artery. Subclavian artery then continue as your axillary artery, yeah, axillary artery, and axillary artery itself has three parts: part 1, part 2, part 3. And again, part 1, part 2, part 3 of the axillary arteries are based on your this pectoralis minor muscle, yeah. So here it was a scalene anterior which divides subclavian artery into three parts. Here it is pectoralis minor muscle which is dividing your axillary artery, into three parts, yeah. And this axillary artery till the part of your teres major muscle, it is axillary artery, and below the teres major muscle it continues, axillary artery continues as your brachial artery. So subclavian artery with its three parts, axillary artery with its three parts, and brachial artery which doesn't have no parts like axillary artery or as subclavian artery. And here is a brachial artery. So Let's talk about this topic is for the subclavian artery. So for the branches of the axillary artery, I'm going to discuss in some other video. But right now, let's concentrate on subclavian artery and its three parts. So here's part 1, part 2, part 3. So let's talk about the part 1. Here you can see part 1 gives three branches. The first one is your vertebral artery. Then is your transverse cervical trunk. This is this portion, only this portion is your transverse cervical trunk. Yeah. And the third part is your this thing, internal thoracic artery. This one, internal thoracic. So first part is giving three branches: your vertebral arteries, your TCT, that is your transverse cervical trunk, and your internal thoracic artery. So these are the first these are the three branches of your first part. Again, here I've drawn, here is your first part of the subclavian artery. Here is the TCT, transverse cervical trunk, and it's giving another few branches of its own and continuation as you're going towards your inferior thyroid artery or your inferior laryngeal artery, sorry. So I'm going to talk about the branches of the TCT further, but let's discuss what arises from the second part. So here's the second part of your this portion. Only this portion is your second part of your subclavian artery, and this second part is posterior to scalene anterior muscle, and it since very easy to remember, since it is numbered as 2, it has two branches. Yeah, the two branches of the second part will be your costocervical and your dorsal scapular artery. Yeah, so here again, here was the first part of your subclavian artery giving your TCT, that is your transverse cervical trunk. Here's your second part, and your second part over here is giving your costocervical, this one, costocervical trunk or costal cervical artery, and your dorsal scapular. Yeah, and here it will be dorsal scapular. Yeah, here it is your dorsal scapular artery. So second part is giving your costocervical and your dorsal scapular artery. Yeah, and the third part is here. Third part has no branches. It's lateral to your scalene anterior, but it doesn't give any branches. Yeah, so let's discuss about the further dividing further discussing these branches of each one of them. So here, since I already mentioned, first branch gives your first part of your subclavian artery gives three branches, three branches, sorry. Vertebral artery, your internal thoracic, yeah, this one, internal thoracic, and your TCT. Now TCT itself gives branches. So this one over here, this one over here is going your, let's see in this diagram much more clear. So here's your transverse cervical trunk, is going above, continuing as your inferior thyroid or inferior laryngeal artery. Then here it is giving two branches. One is your suprascapular, and this one is your transverse cervical. So this one, transverse cervical, is giving further your superficial cervical and your dorsal scapular. Yeah. So your transverse cervical trunk itself is giving two branches. One is your transverse cervical, which further gives two branches. One is superficial cervical and one is your dorsal scapular. And another branch of your TCT, this trunk, is your suprascapular. Yeah. So TCT gives two branches. One is your transverse cervical and one is your suprascapular. Yeah. Transverse further gives two branches, superficial cervical and your dorsal scapular. So don't you confuse suprascapular and dorsal scapular. And now this TCT further, you can say it gives another branch, overall ascending cervical, yeah, which gives your inferior thyroid and your inferior laryngeal arteries. Yeah. So overall, we can say TCT. It has three letters in it. Three. So one is your suprascapular, one is your transverse cervical, and one is your ascending cervical. So these are the branches of the TCT, which all are coming from the first part. So again, for the quick recap, as we can see, here's the first part of the SCA, subclavian artery. First artery to arise from the subclavian artery is your vertebral artery. One going above is your TCT, that is the trunk, transverse cervical trunk, and one going below, one going downwards is your internal thoracic, artery. Now this TCT itself is divided into three. Basically, it gives two branches, but one is your ascending, another one, so that's why we can consider the third one also. The one which is going above and forming further, gonna form your will lead to your inferior thyroid and your inferior laryngeal arteries. This is the ascending cervical. This one over here would be your suprascapular, and this one over here would be your transverse cervical. Suprascapular, transverse cervical. Transverse cervical is the one which gives branches. This one, superficial cervical and your dorsal scapular. This is your suprascapular, coming itself from your TCT, but your dorsal scapular is coming from your transverse cervical. So this was all about the first part. Second part, as I already mentioned, second part gives two branches, costocervical and your dorsal scapular. Now, as you can see, dorsal scapular, I have mentioned, it could be from your TCT also. This one was, I have already mentioned dorsal scapular. Dorsal scapular, but in many cases, dorsal scapular may arise from your second part. It can arise from your second part. So it can either be a part of your first part, that is from your TCT, or it can be directly arise from your second part of your subclavian artery. So here's the diagram for that. Here's the first part with the TCT, vertebral artery and your internal thoracic I haven't drawn. Second part is the one. Here's the one artery coming directly from your second part is your costocervical artery, costocervical. Costocervical continues as your deep cervical on this side, and one coming below from your deep cervical is your superior intercostal artery. So costocervical is the main artery which further gives two branches. One is your deep cervical and your superior intercostal. And one artery coming from the second part is your dorsal scapular. So don't you it might be confusing, dorsal scapular, because I already mentioned dorsal scapular might come from your TCT, transverse cervical branch, dorsal scapular here, or you can see this one. But it can arise from your second part of your subclavian artery also. So that's why it can be confusing, but one must be familiar with the dorsal scapular and deep cervical, transverse cervical. The nomenclature of these arteries is very important. So overall, this is all about the subclavian artery. So you need to listen few times to grasp this nomenclature of these arteries. Thank you.